All right. Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Columbia Global Centers Paris. We are Columbia University's academic center in France with a footprint in this beautiful site called Reed Hall since 1964. For the past decades, one of our main focuses beyond teaching and research has been the promotion of the rich artistic, cultural, and intellectual ties that connect France and the United States. But as the world has expanded beyond bilateral relations, so has our programming, which is now connected to Columbia's global network of 11 centers, each of which is committed to addressing some of the pressing challenges of today's world. This evening's conversation on climate change addresses one of these vital questions, that is, the impact and cost of climate change on vulnerable regions. By dealing with loss and damage, climate negotiations acknowledge the responsibility of developed nations for their emissions and the need to support countries in the global south that are disproportionately affected by climate change. Beyond the support and assistance to these vulnerable communities, the inclusion of loss and damage in climate talks is a crucial way of ensuring a form of climate justice. I'm honored to introduce this evening's moderator, Melody Brown, who will guide us through this meaningful conversation. Melody is the climate response lead at the Columbia Global Center Paris. An expert in climate risk management, she is a scholar at the Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia's newly created climate school. Her work focuses on capacity building, design, and support of strategies to improve integration of climate information into decision-making processes, to increase climate risk management and resilience building. She is particularly interested in systemic and transdisciplinary participatory, well, I'm French and some words in English sound very difficile, processes to bridge the gap between decision makers, climate scientists, and policymakers. And that is exactly what Melody has been doing so brilliantly at the Paris Center. Melody, thank you for taking the lead this evening and introducing tonight's speakers.
Thank you so much, Séverine. Thank you everyone for coming, welcome. So, very happy to be here with you all, and one of the goals of tonight is also to bring together, to create that interface between people with a climate science background, people with a policy background, people with a practitioner's background, and also people who are just interested in learning more about those conversations that we're having within those sectors, and who don't necessarily have a lot of background information. So welcome to all of you. So we're very happy to have three wonderful panelists tonight. So Professor Saleemul Huq is the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICCCAD, in Bangladesh. And he's also a senior fellow at the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED, in London. Saleem has been involved in building negotiating capacity and supporting the engagement of least developed countries in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, including negotiator training workshops for least developed countries, policy briefings, support to the Adaptation Fund Board, research into vulnerability and adaptation to climate change in the least developed countries, starting with Bangladesh, but also expanding to developing countries around the world. Saleem was also a lead author on the chapter on adaptation and sustainable development in the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is the group of scientists providing the latest updates on science on climate change, and one of the coordinating lead authors on interrelationships between adaptation and mitigation in the fourth assessment report. He was named to Nature's 10 people who helped shape science in 2022, among other things. And very, very glad that he's here. We're very lucky to have him in Paris because he's usually mostly in Bangladesh. So thank you so much for being here. We also have Mathilde Bord-Laurans. Mathilde has over 15 years of experience in development finance in the energy, infrastructure, and climate sectors. She graduated as an engineer from NGREF and École Centrale de Paris. She joined the Agence Française du Développement, AFD, in 2005, and she's been working and managing projects on the energy transition, biodiversity conservation, in particular in Africa, before joining the private sector subsidiary of AFD, Proparco, where she managed AFD's energy transition activity. She's now the head of the climate and nature team at AFD, which gathers experts working on in the fields of climate and biodiversity, which are very central to the mandate of AFD. So she's going to be able to provide a lot of insights on what the French Development Bank can do on the question of funding resilience. And finally, Emmanuel Guerin. He was a special advisor to the climate negotiations ambassador Laurence Toubiana and Foreign Affairs Minister Laurent Fabius during COP21, which led to the Paris Agreement. So in 2014-15, he led the drafting team of the Paris Agreement, and then after that, he was executive director for international affairs at the European Climate Foundation. Before that, he was also an associate director at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, and a member of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And he's also the director of the Energy and Climate He was the director of the Energy and Climate Program at the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations from 2006 to 2011. And Emmanuel teaches country climate politics and policies at Sciences Po. So we have quite a diverse panel. We're going to have more or less 45 minutes to an hour of conversation with the panelists, as lively as possible, and then we'll have about 30 minutes of conversation with the room, so feel free to write down if you have questions and things you want to discuss again after. And at the end of the conversation, we'll invite you for a reception, which I believe will be just right outside the Grande Salle, so that's going to be an opportunity to have more follow-up conversations with all the panelists and among yourselves as well. So thank you to all of you for joining us. And maybe as a first question, I think the first question will go to Saleem. We have a lot of people here who may have different levels of understanding and knowledge about the climate negotiations, the question of financing resilience. Can you give us a bit of an overview of what are the climate negotiations and how do we talk about resilience in the context of the climate negotiations?
Thank you very much, Melody, and good evening to everybody. Assalamu alaikum. So let me start with the origin of global policymaking on tackling this global problem of climate change, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was signed and agreed in 1972. It's a long time ago in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil at the Earth Summit. And as it came into force by all countries in the world, there are now every country in the world has signed up to it, which is a good thing. We've all agreed to do things. We all come together, the countries, governments all come together every year at something called the Conference of Parties, COP. The first COP was held in Germany, in Berlin, in 1995. And since then, every year, towards the end of the year, usually in November or December, a Conference of Parties is held. It moves from continent to continent. It was in 2015, it was in France, in Paris, where we had the historic Paris Agreement agreed here. Just recently, the last COP was COP27, which was held it was the African COP. It was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. The next COP, coming up in December this year, is going to be in the Middle East. It's going to be hosted by the United Arab Emirates, and it will be held in Dubai. Now, if you are reasonably familiar, if all of that is familiar to you, and you've been following the international discussions on climate change, actions on climate change to some extent, then I want to let you know that everything you've learned so far is now practically redundant. All right? We have, as of this year, entered into a brand new era of the climate change issue. And this era is the era of impacts due to, attributable to, the fact that global temperature is now well above 1 degree centigrade due to the emissions of greenhouse gases that caused the problem in the first place, and they're happening now. So until now, it was all anticipating it's going to happen, how are we going to prepare for it? Now that's over. We have crossed the threshold. It's now happening. And every single day, every week, every month, every year from now on, you just have to watch your television screens and you'll see climate impacts happening somewhere in the world. Spain has a heat wave right now. California has wildfires, and Canada has wildfires that have, smoke has moved all the way to New York. In New York City, people can't see. It's become completely smoke-filled. And this is going to happen everywhere, all countries, developing countries, poor countries. We've been hit some time ago. We've been facing the problem for some time. But now it's going to hit everybody, in France, in Germany, in the UK, all over the world. Every day, just watch the TV weather report at the end of the news, and you'll see something happening somewhere. Right? Right now, there are floods in Pakistan. Right? Again, they had big floods earlier. They're having floods again. So every day now, somewhere in the world, we will be seeing impacts of climate change. And the fact that these impacts are happening is not entirely due to climate change, human-induced climate change, but the fact that they are getting worse is due to human-induced climate change. So we are causing climatic impacts to get much, much more severe going forward. And this is now scientifically attributable. The scientists who work on climate change attribution in Working Group 1 of the IPCC, in the last IPCC report, they have already shown, they have unequivocal evidence of impacts that can be attributed to the fact that global temperature has already risen by 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial. So we have entered what I'm calling the new era of losses and damages from climate change, which makes this topic so much more important for us to deal with, because quite frankly, nobody in the world is ready for this. The leaders of the G7, the biggest economies in the world, just met a few weeks ago in Hiroshima, in Japan. They don't have a clue. They think business as usual is going to solve the problem. It isn't. We have entered a brand new era where old thinking, old ways of working are simply not going to cut it, which is one reason why I'm very glad to be here, invited by President Macron for the summit that he's organizing over the next few days, where he's trying to get leaders to rethink the way that the whole financial system in the world is geared up. It's not fit for purpose. It is not ready to tackle climate change, not in the rich countries, not in the poor countries, not globally. So the challenge that we all have to face, and every single one of us is going to have to face it, whether we like it or not. We can either learn to deal with it and be prepared, or we can be unprepared and get hit by it. Those are the only two choices that each of us has. And I think that we all need to think about it, find a way to deal with it, and do our best to work together to see that we can minimize the losses and damages. We cannot prevent them. They're going to happen, but we can certainly minimize them. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so basically you're saying that we're seeing a lot of impacts on climate change all over the news. This is obviously not going to stop happening anytime soon. You're saying we're very unprepared, but we're also heading towards COP28, which is the 28th session of climate negotiations, right? So we're entering a new era because there are a lot of new recent updates that have been happening that are good signs of progress that we're heading in the right direction. But I want to take a step back, and I wonder, I'm going to just take a show of hands, just how many people are familiar with the Paris Agreement or have heard about the Paris Agreement without necessarily knowing the details? Okay, most people in the room, right? Even if you haven't really been following the negotiations, you've probably heard at least some level of information about the Paris Agreement. And you've probably heard that the Paris Agreement was a historic our historic step in the history of the climate negotiations. So I'm going to go to Emmanuel first, and then we'll loop back to just Emmanuel. You followed the Paris Agreement very closely. You were very closely involved. Can you just say a few words about like why was the Paris Agreement such a historic step? And then from there we'll see what further progress has been made since.
Sure, happy to say a few words about that. And the world has changed quite a bit for the past 8 years when the Paris Agreement was adopted. So I'll try to walk us as well to some of the latest development and most importantly the way Saleem put it, the fact that we're very much entering into the era of extremely frequent and severe climate impacts, and that bears consequences on the climate regime. When the Paris Agreement was adopted, without getting into all of the stories, there are specific parts of the agreement that are attributable to some countries and some people, in particular within those delegations. The temperature increase limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius, as opposed to simply trying to limit that temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius, was very much a victory, I think, for the vulnerable countries, the least developed countries in Africa, but also many other vulnerable countries, both low and middle income in Southeast Asia, small island developing states in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. It's been very visible since Paris, I think, in part because of what happened 4 years after, with the beginning of the climate strikes and the climate marches by the youth movement, and the fact that both the Paris Agreement as a framework, but this particular objective was the rallying cry for the youth in both the global north and the global south. And that means something which is very important, in particular because all of that also took place on the basis of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Expert Panel on Climate Change special report for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which made it very clear to people by forcing us, to be honest, each of us, to have a look at the projections of what are the risks and the impacts at different levels of temperature increase. I mean, it's honestly a good, if very painful and sometimes sad thing to do, to explore how it will play out in different regions of the world and in different scenarios. What was not indeed as visible in Paris in 2015, but has come to the front line of the global climate fight last year with the agreement in Sharm el-Sheikh for the creation of a loss and damage facility, is indeed a topic that Saleem and a few others, both in this room and much beyond, have pioneered for a very long time. So it's true that for the rest of us, we're entering into this new era now, maybe, but there is a lot of knowledge on the ground for how to cope with those different impacts, and they are different rapid extreme events are not the same thing as slow onset events. So it's important to open the black box of what we mean by loss and damage, and I'm sure we'll do that in this conversation. At the other end of the spectrum, if you will, there is the issue of who is going to pay for all of that, which is not just a technical question of policy design to put in place a new levy on maritime or aviation transportation, but a very political question, also given the order of magnitude of what we're talking about in terms of investment needs. But I might come back to that later, because it's also quite precisely the topic of the summit that President Macron and I shall say the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, have been championing and hosting in Paris in a few days.
Absolutely, thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. So basically, the Paris Agreement was 8 years ago, and a lot of things have happened since. I guess to summarize, there had been a lot of efforts before the Paris Agreement to reach a global agreement. Some of them, the Kyoto Protocol was very legally binding, like very ambitious, but not a lot of people joined, and it didn't really work. And then there were attempts to develop other types of agreements, in Copenhagen, for example, where they tried to do something that a lot of people were willing to join, but that was not really legally binding, that didn't have very ambitious goals. And then they got to Paris, and Paris was sort of a mix of those different attempts that had been tried before. And it was historic because everybody had to agree. So 195 countries agreed to take a step together to address the climate crisis. And the way the climate negotiations work is it's not by vote, it's by consensus. So every single country has to agree on what's being proposed, otherwise it doesn't move forward. And one of the key things of the Paris Agreement was that it divided some of the work into 3 different buckets, 3 different topics. We need to reduce the emissions, because otherwise, because we want to stay under 2 degrees, ideally under 1.5. We need to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And then for the first time, there was an article on loss and damage, which is a topic that Saleem and others have been fighting for a long time, which is basically saying, even if we reduce the emissions, even if we adapt to the impacts, there's going to be things that are lost and things that are damaged, and those things are going to happen in the most vulnerable countries that contributed the least to climate change, and it needs to be addressed. But how do we address it is a big question. And there were major oppositions to it, for example, from the US, among others. And it was approved, it was included in the Paris Agreement as a separate article. And so that was a major win, a lot of, many years of work to get to that point where it was included as an article, with a lot of exceptions and debate around what it means and what it looks like, but it was included, and that was a win. And then from there, okay, so now we have recognition that we have to do mitigation, we have to do adaptation, we have to work on loss and damage, but what does that mean? And so in those 8 years between the Paris Agreement and last climate negotiation, there was another new big milestone, which was they decided to create a fund for loss and damage. But again, the question is, what does that look like? How does that work? How is that different from the work that is already being done on adaptation around the world? And so we have three experts here who've worked on different aspects of these questions. So Saleem, can you tell us more about this last bit of this creation of this loss and damage fund and what it means for least developed countries? What's new about this?
Yes, so as you just mentioned, one of the issues with having loss and damage addressed in the UN Framework Convention was the fact that the UN Framework Convention, which has 195 countries as members of it who have signed up to the convention, every single decision, every comma, every word, every sentence has to be agreed by everybody. And Emmanuel had to do that in Paris in COP21. Big job, not easy to do. Everybody has to agree. And so when the vulnerable countries who are the victims of the impacts of climate change ask for the polluting countries to provide support for the pollution countries have to agree. And they don't agree. They did not agree for many, many, many years. They said, no, we're not going to pay. And until last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in COP27, where we managed to persuade all countries, including the most reluctant, which is the United States of America, to agree to set up a new fund for addressing loss and damage. And the way that this is going to be done is they have set up something called the Transitional Committee with members from different geographic regions and groups. That's been set up. The Transitional Committee has been given a mandate to come up with proposals. It has met twice already. It has 2 more meetings before COP28. So in COP28, the Transitional Committee will come with ideas to take forward, how to set up the fund. There's a question that they are addressing right now. In fact, there was a pre-COP meeting in Bonn just a few days ago where they met. One of the issues is, do we have a new fund or do we just use existing funding arrangements? And there's a logic for both. There are existing funding arrangements that can be supplemented and supported and they can be mobilized quickly, but they don't address everything. And in particular, I would say one of the big gaps is displacement of people because of sea level rise around the world. Small islands and low-lying deltas like my country, Bangladesh. In Bangladesh right now, every single day, more than 2,000 people are migrating from the low-lying coastal zone into Dhaka city. Dhaka is the capital of Bangladesh. It's the fastest growing capital in the whole world. And the projections are that these climate migrants will be in possibly reaching 10 million people within a decade. And Dhaka cannot absorb 10 million people. What are we going to do? These people are coming. Every day they arrive in Dhaka and then they disperse into the slums and they start living there. Right now, nobody's looking after them. The government doesn't know who they are and doesn't do anything for them. The Red Cross, Red Crescent, the existing humanitarian aid systems do not work for them. But they're happening and they're going to get worse. And they are climate change. They are being displaced because of climate change, not by a cyclone or a flood, climate change. And so, in my view, that is a logic for the UN Framework Convention in COP28 in Dubai to set up a brand new fund to address them, to address that particular problem. We'll see what they come up with, but I'm hopeful that they might be able to do that.
So we're going to go back to what are the different options to find funding to support loss and damage, right? But first, Mathilde, you work for the French Development Agency. What does it look like for AFD? First of all, how do you support adaptation? And then what does this new focus on loss and damage look like for AFD?
Thank you, Melody. Maybe just a step back on this COP27 decision on loss and damage, and also to reflect on the discussions that we had as we were preparing for this session. You were saying we have to tell people what is a COP, and we hear a lot about the fact that the COPs are too slow to provide results, and that it's not delivering sufficiently. And of course, we know that the urgency is there, and we are all frustrated. From the north or from the south, of course, not the same impact in our countries, but all frustrated. And I think what happened at COP27 with the loss and damage decision is something which is interesting, because it's something where you see and understand when you are there why COP still matter. Because what is done and being decided, and what has been decided at this COP, was not written and negotiated before Sharm el-Sheikh. And so therefore the fact that there is political pressure, that no northern country wants to take the responsibility to see total failure in a COP is making those type of discussion progressing. And so I think it's very important to understand this. And of course, for a development finance institution like us, it has impacts. So I'm part of the French interministerial team on climate, but I'm not a negotiator. I'm here because AFD is delivering a large part of the French financial commitment under the famous 100 billion, which are to be delivered to the countries from the south under the Copenhagen promise. Which we are a bit late in delivering and should be delivered in 2023, so starting from this year. We are, as AFD, providing a bit more than 5 billion of the French 6 billion euro commitment. So every decision which is taken under the UNFCCC related to finance has implication for what AFD is doing. We have progressed a lot on a number of issues. One of them, which is critical and which is really important to us and often left aside a little bit recently, is alignment. Paris alignment is something on which AFD has been taken a commitment back in 2017, and on something for which we go every year at the COP to discuss with our peers on what it means. And it means not only working on mitigation, it means on delivering on all the articles of the Paris Agreement, so including resilience, including loss and damage. And of course, due to that, we also have progress on adaptation finance. It's never enough, but when the Paris Agreement was approved, our adaptation funding was around 500 million per year. Now we are at a bit more than 2 billion. We quadruple. It's still, so it's good, but it's only a third of our climate finance. So we need to progress on that. And we need also to progress on the assessment of what is adaptation finance, what is loss and damage finance. Shall we separate really the two? 1 euro is 1 euro. When you provide 1 euro to social safety net in Senegal, for instance, today we count it as adaptation finance, but it can be considered as preparation for loss and damage. So all this work is in fact very convergent and consistent. And the progress which have been seen at the COP 27 on the loss and damage fund is also very interesting for us, because we can be more transparent now in saying, yes, we do also work with countries from the south on their preparedness in terms of loss and damage. Adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and loss and damage is a continuity of a continuum of work, and we want and we need to work on every aspect of this work. So one basic consequence for AFD of the COP27 is that suddenly we have a mandate to work on loss and damage. And this Paris summit is very much about that as well. It was announced before, at the very beginning, the first day of the COP. So most certainly a good political intuition of President Macron and his councillors, that's for sure. But a recognition that indeed we were at the age of consequences. The Pakistani floods had happened, the fires in France over the summer, and that we needed to take this into account and completely review the financial architecture and give a mandate to the public development bank from the multilaterals, which are the World Bank and the other regional banks, to the National Development Bank, and of course the bilaterals were like AFD and others.
Thank you. Okay, so basically, initially when we started the negotiations, we were focusing just on reducing emissions. Then we started talking about adapting to the impact. Then we started recognizing that there's more than that, and that there are going to be losses and damages, mostly in developing countries, that need to be addressed. Then it was recognized in the Paris Agreement. Now there's a fund for that, and that gives mandates, as we've heard, to organizations like the AFD to start allocating money to that. But there are big questions that remain to be addressed. One is, where does this money come from? And another one is basically, how do we define loss and damage? What's the difference between adaptation and loss and damage, and how do we decide how much money goes where? So I want to first go back on one of the things that you said, Mathilde. There was a promise made by developed countries to developing countries to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to support mitigation and adaptation, so reducing the emissions and adapting. And that was before we were recognizing loss and damage, really. So that's why it's not part of that. This promise has still not been met. We're hoping it's going to be met this year, but we still haven't reached the $100 billion a year to support developing countries. And the portion that has been allocated is going largely towards reducing emissions, and it's not 50-50 between reducing emissions and supporting adaptation. So in that context, I'm going to turn to Emmanuel again, and then we'll ask for each of your thoughts. But Emmanuel, considering that the promise, the $100 billion a year still hasn't been met, in your experience, what are some of the options to find finance to address loss and damage? What are some of the options on the table that have been discussed so far?
Great. So indeed, I mean, the floor in all of this conversation needs to be that the rich countries, countries of the G7 in particular, so Europe and the US and Japan and Canada and the others, mobilize mainly through our taxpayer money the funds that need to support climate mitigation and adaptation actions in developing countries in general, quite specifically the most vulnerables of them as well. The question of how to pay for loss and damage, but even before that, how much to pay for loss and damage is, for all of the reasons that Saleem told you about, somehow a different question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not even clear what the order of magnitude is of what we are talking about. And for a variety of reasons that might be where others are going after me, because we're talking about economic but also non-economic losses and damages, because we're talking to as I said earlier, both the extreme weather events attributable to climate change, like floods, like droughts, but also the slow onset events like sea level rise and the declining agricultural productivity more generally. And well, we're entering into this conversation partly blind for the very reason that was stressed before, which is that in the context of the negotiations, the rich countries historically, and it's true, this is where the position of the US was historically different from that of the European Union, but wanted to draw a complete red line in between the attribution and the compensation, paying for the costs. Well, the question is, what do we do with this? Because it's a very practical question, and I'll start by saying that this is a very practical question for all of us. in particular, first order priority, the poorest and the most vulnerable and the poorest and the most vulnerable countries, but also, quite frankly, all of us, including the well-off in the rich world. We're having this conversation just a few weeks after something really massive happened in California, and I think we'll retrospectively look back in time and think, oh, this is when it started for real, because you've got insurers saying that they will no longer insure private property against climate risks in a region like California. And again, we're just entering into this reality now. I mean, it means that both, by the way, insurers and reinsurers are saying there are places on our shared planet Earth where we don't have a business model to operate. Of course, it's not going to be limited to California. It's going to spread quite fast to a few other places. And the default scenario, as I'm sure everybody is able to draw the implications for themselves, is it's going to make the costs of mortgage, if people can get a mortgage at all, much more expensive or difficult. And at some point the state is going to have to say, okay, maybe there isn't a private insurance model, but we need to put in place a state guaranteed one. But how to do that, right? You've got basically two options. We're all familiar with those discussions now. I mean, either you do it by debt, but first, it's not a possibility for that many countries around the world these days, and even in the richest countries, there is very limited scope to do this. So that's one option. The other option is going to be to raise money somewhere in the economy, and that's where I want to go. I think at some point, the very basic, if not consistently applied principle of the polluters pay is going to have to be part of the response to paying for loss and damage both in the global south and in the global north, as a matter of solidarity, legal responsibilities, but also economic management within our countries. So that's one of the discussions that's going to be very live at the summit in a few days. To put a name on it, taxing fossil fuels to generate some of the resources we're talking about. It's obviously not a new conversation. It's been happening pretty much since the beginning of those discussions. But there is a renewed sense of urgency now around it. And there will be some practical questions, if you will. What's the scope to do that? Which emissions or fossil fuel combustions are we going after? Coal, oil, gas, oil and jet fuels in particular for aviation, or the carbon in fuels for maritime transportation. But it's also very good. It's also going to be a very political question of: do we tax fossil fuel emissions at the point of consumption, or do we do it at the point of production? And the politics of that are obviously very different in net fossil fuel importers like Europe, or net fossil fuel exporters like the US, and like indeed the place where, of all places, we'll be having a COP at the end of the year. So it's going to continue that thread until Abu Dhabi, for sure. Dubai, sorry.
That's actually a great segue to my next question. But just on what you were saying, do we tax at the consumption or at the source? This is also what led to the Gilets jaunes, to the whole Gilets jaunes question in France. But I don't want to get too much into that. Actually, so the next COP is happening in Dubai. The president of the next COP is the head of one of the biggest oil companies. And you're saying one of the options is to tax fossil fuel companies, right? So how do the three of you feel about the chances of this happening when the next climate negotiations is going to take place in Dubai under the presidency that is led by the head of one of the biggest oil companies? Is it something we can achieve? How do we achieve that? How do you put pressure on through the negotiations to make that happen? The floor is open to, the question is for the three of you, so whoever wants to take the mic.
I'll avoid the answer, but answer partly. And I hope Salim will answer.
Let me address that thorny question. All right? And I'll share with the audience something that happened in the last couple of months. So the incoming designated president of COP28, he hasn't taken over yet, he takes over at the beginning of COP28, is Dr. Sultan Al Jaber from the United Arab Emirates, who happens to be the head of the ADNOC, the UAE's oil agency. And he's a very well-known oil CEO person. But he's also a very, very capable person. That's why the UAE government and Sultan appointed him as COP president. And one of the things he has done as the COP president is he has invited a number of experts from around the world to be part of his expert advisory group, including, I think, Laurence Toubiana is also one of them. Laurence? Yes. And there are a number of them. So he invited me, all right, to be one of his advisors. And I thought about it before I accepted the invitation. And I eventually decided to accept. But I did it on one condition. I told him this. I said, I am going to be a one agenda advisor. And my agenda is for you to set up and operationalize the loss and damage fund in Dubai in COP28. If you can do that, then whatever else you do on oil, I'm not really going to bother with that. But this is the one thing that I'm going to ask you to do. And it can only be done if you, as the incoming COP president, invest your political capital from now, not in Dubai in December, but now, in getting other world leaders to address this issue and say, we will do it. And telling the transitional committee that I mentioned earlier that's been set up, that you want them to come to Dubai with a plan of action to actually set up this fund. Because if you leave it to them, they will not do it. They will work on the UNFCCC time, which is 3, 4, 5 years before anything will happen. We had a decision in COP27, but they'll take COP28, COP29, COP30, maybe COP31, where they'll actually come out with something in their own process. You cannot wait for them. You cannot afford to wait. You will have to make it happen. And I suggested, why don't you offer funding from the United Arab Emirates? Why don't you impose a levy on air passengers who are going to fly into Dubai? Put $10 on every flight, that's $10, $20 million just there. So you have to be innovative, you have to be politically active, you have to drive that agenda item from now and make it happen. And I cited the example of Paris. The success of Paris did not happen in Paris. It happened a whole year before Paris. I remember I was in Bangladesh at that time. The French foreign minister, the French ambassadors, the French establishment came to Bangladesh repeatedly over the whole year. The ambassador at that time, Sophie Aubert, she held meeting after meeting with civil society in Bangladesh, and all the French ambassadors did the same. So the French reached out to everybody for 12 months before anybody came to Paris for the COP. And that way they built a lot of trust. They said, we'll do our best. We're listening to you. They came and listened to us. And that in itself gained them the trust that they will be honest brokers and they will get us an agreement that takes into account our views. And I told the COP president, the COP28 president, you're going to have to do the same. You're going to have to build the trust of the countries that are going to come to Dubai in December and get them to agree to a political decision, which is your responsibility. If you leave it to the negotiators, they will not do it.
Actually, so I hope that helps you understand that, okay, my frustration when we come back from COP every year is that I feel like a lot of the news about COP could be written before COP. A lot of the news say, and it's not going fast enough, and it's not going far enough, and it's just fossil fuel companies that are gathering, that are doing greenwashing. And first of all, this is only a tiny portion of what happens at COP. It's not untrue, it is true, but it's a tiny portion of what happens. What happens during COP is only the tip of the iceberg, and a lot of the work that led to the Paris Agreement and to the other major progress is what Saleem is describing, is all those, and what all three actually have been part of for many years, is all the work that happens in the preparation of COP, in the bilateral meetings, in the meetings with civil society, the meetings with all the different stakeholders before COP. And then at COP, and that's something that I'm curious to hear from all of you too, at COP there are many different stakeholders that show up. And yes, there are some fossil fuel companies, and there's a big discussion about the space that they should or should not have in the negotiations and at the table. But there are also a lot of young people, a lot of indigenous communities, a lot of representatives from civil society that are pushing specific agendas, usually supporting least developed countries, usually pushing for more climate justice. And that's not really something that the medias talk a lot about when they report about COP. A lot of people go for different reasons. I'm curious to hear what are the different mechanisms to influence a COP decision or progress on the topics that are discussed at COP? What are different things that you think contribute to the success of COP?
Maybe I would like to take a step back on your previous point. I was saying I wanted to avoid the question, but I will still share some opinion and also reflecting on what Saleemul has just said, and with the Paris Summit. The Paris Summit is not only one of the decision, and one part of the discussion will be about how to find new funding. It's true. I think what we are trying to achieve, or what they are trying to achieve with this summit, is also to try to have the discussion outside of the UNFCCC, and to try to see what kind of political support some part of the agenda could have from various countries. And this is why it's so important to have the Prime Minister of China joining the discussion, because a large part of the discussion that is going to happen and that we didn't refer to is about debt sustainability, and this debt is owned by countries from the north, but also, especially for African countries, by China, which is a larger creditor than all of us together, OECD countries. So this is important to support this, to support the discussion and try to see where there can be some changes in the negotiating positions that we have known for years. And so beyond new taxation, there is also the question of who should pay beyond the countries from the north, and notably, should China, and maybe even India or Arabia Saudi, pay part of the loss and damage, as they are also large emitters today. And this is a very important discussion to have for everybody around the table, for us in the north, because how our taxpayer will agree on a political decision to support this loss and damage call if they don't have the feeling or the opinion that it has been shared with the emitters of the world. So this is very important to have this in mind as well. And this is how we build, I think, also a decision at COP, is outside of the UNFCCC, outside of the COP, with this type of summit, and this is very important to do. Now, to come back to your question on what is happening, how a decision is taken also there, for instance, AFD, we are working basically with the finance team on the negotiation, notably on what is called the new collective quantified goal. Terrible wording, which is what's going to happen after this 100 billion promise, what is going to be the next amount. Of course, it's our work, so we're working on this, working on the wording, but we're also working with our partners to see, okay, what it means for a bank in the south. There is this goal, but there is also the alignment goal of the Paris Agreement. How can we link the two? And this is a critical negotiation aspect, which crystallizes a lot of tensions. Alignment versus this political support from the north to the south. And I don't say they have to fight. I say we have to have both, of course. And regarding having the youth and the NGOs, all civil society, putting pressure around the COP, before the COP, during the COP, and after the COP on the success of it, complaining that it's not enough, continue. They have to continue, because of course without that, we wouldn't have what I said earlier, is that Timmermans doesn't want to be considered as the one who has not managed to get a decision at COP. Personally, he doesn't want. So it's also a question of persons, and this is why it's so important to have this participation of the civil society during the negotiations and around the negotiations.
Anything to add to this specific point?
No, well, frankly, I think this COP, and I'll be blunt, it's an odd choice. There is a reason for that, which is that you rotate from one region of the United Nations to the other. So there has to be a time when it is in this region of the world. I guess it's important also because that helps to be practical, to put the UAE into the United Arab Emirates into a bit of a perspective, including their national oil and gas company. They don't really like it when we tell them this, but they're small. It's a small oil and gas producing country in the big scheme of things. Like the net profits of the fossil fuel companies last year, as a direct consequence of the war in Ukraine and the embargo against Russia, it's 4 trillion, so 4,000 of billions of net profits by the fossil fuel companies in total. The one from the United Arab Emirates, it's 1 billion total. To talk about what's closer to home is 33 billion. So that's the difference in between the UAE and Total. I think we should also make sure that the biggest polluters, in particular the historical emitters, are the ones who contribute first and foremost to putting some money into this, I hope, newly established facility on loss and damage. Quite frankly, we've got to turn the fact that this COP is in this region of the world to put pressure on those countries to do way more. They've got GDP per capita that are way above the OECD average, and they are swimming in cash. That's the thing, right? There is no shortage of money. It's immoral, but also not the right thing to do from a good economic perspective. And I would say that in terms of putting pressure on the COP from the outside, since I'm sure that was also the question, insisting on the fact that there is one indicator that matters to test if fossil fuel companies and countries are seriously invested in the energy transition, because they tell us all the time about their commitment to carbon neutrality. And well, if you happen to take the plane in Paris, you're bombarded with those commercials from Total, who is telling you that they've become the company of all energies with an S. That was the comms plan, and you see pictures of indeed all forms of energies but one, oil. So the point is, the ratio of investing into the continuation of fossil fuels, including with a technology that's called carbon capture and sequestration, which is what the fossil fuel industry wants to talk about, but the ratio of that versus investing in renewable energy technologies, management of the grid with intermittent sources as well, this is what we should be looking at, quite frankly. And that's the way to assess the performance also of a country like the UAE, to assess the performance of a company like Total, and where some of the money hopefully is going to come from as well at the end of the day.
I think you made a really good point, which is there are two ways of looking at the fact that the next COP is happening in Dubai. You can look at it as it completely discredits the whole process because it is in an oil-emitting country and it's going to be led by the head of a big oil company. Or you can looking at it in a way where you say, well, actually, that's maybe the only way to put pressure on them and to get them to change. And it's a debate that's been going on for quite a while in the UNFCCC, in the climate negotiations, is should we keep the oil companies out of the conversation because they caused the problem, or should we invite them to the table because we're not going to solve it without them? And it's very split. There are very, very different opinions on that. But I think that's a really good way of putting things. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm just going to do one last question to try to localize that discussion, because we've talked a lot about how we discuss loss and damage in the climate negotiations at the global level. Concretely, if we manage to get money into that fund, what does it look like at local level? And so what does it look like in Bangladesh, and what does it look like in other projects, in your experience, other projects that you might have been working on? What does that mean concretely on the ground for frontline communities?
Thank you, Melody. So let me start with the topic of adaptation to climate change, which is something I've been working on for many, many years. And within the adaptation arena, and particularly within the funding for adaptation, which you've already mentioned is inadequate compared to funding that goes for mitigation, there's another second-order issue that has been identified by scholars, particularly Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that focuses on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation, where they've looked at hundreds of adaptation-funded projects around the world. And they have found a very significant number of these projects, which were very top-down, externally driven projects, did not add any value. Right? They didn't give any additional benefits. And some of them, quite a few of them, actually made things worse. Not only did they not add value, they made the situation worse. And we have termed in the climate change scholarship, we call that maladaptation. So you try to do adaptation, but you end up making it worse. And while the reasons in each case are different because every location is different, there is one general reason that they found that is true almost everywhere. And that is the projects came with money from outside and with experts from outside. who said, this is what you have to do, and here is the money to do it. And local people said, all right, we'll do it. We did it. But if you asked us in advance, we'd say, this is not going to work. But nobody asked them. Okay? So this effort to provide a very top-down, so-called expert-driven adaptation solution has not worked. And those of us who work in adaptation, we have a countervailing area that we work in, which we call locally led adaptation, which the premise is, before you decide to do something somewhere, talk to the local people, because they know the problem. And sometimes they have some very good solutions which you can listen to and you can support, but nobody does that. So if you look at the quantum of adaptation funding that has arrived, only 10% has actually gone to the most vulnerable communities. 90% has disappeared somewhere along the way, from the donor to the government to international consultants. A whole bunch of people got money from the middle, and the vulnerable communities only got 10% of it. Okay, so we are very much in the promotion of locally led adaptation, and that's what my center does. We have a big growing community of practice around the world, which incidentally now includes developed countries, because developed countries are also having to adapt and also locally finding adaptation solutions. And so we are part of this global community of practice on locally led adaptation. But now, it's not just adaptation isn't enough, because when the climate change impact happens, then you have to segue from adaptation into loss and damage, addressing loss and damage. So we call this a nexus now. And in fact, we run courses for people, practitioners working on locally led adaptation. We have a course coming up just in the next few days in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. We have a number of international participants coming. We used to do it on locally led adaptation. Now we are doing it on the nexus between locally led adaptation and preparing for loss and damage. And let me end by giving you an illustration of what this means. A few weeks ago, there was a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal in our part of the world called Cyclone Mocha. While it was in the sea in the Bay of Bengal, it went from a category 3 to a category 4 to a category 5, the super cyclone strength. In Bangladesh, we were tracking it, we had the information, we had 500,000 people already going to shelters, ready for it to strike. At one point, it was heading for the Rohingya camps, which is, they are not as well protected as the rest of the country. And that was the worst case scenario. If it hit the Rohingya camp, the way the refugees, the Myanmar refugees live, that would have been a really big disaster. But the rest of the country, the rest of the coastal zone, we were ready, we are prepared. We have one of the best cyclone warning and protection systems in the world. Then fortunately for us, just a few hours before it hit the mainland, it veered to the east and it crossed Bangladesh, but the southern tip of Bangladesh, nobody died in Bangladesh, and it went into Myanmar, into the Rakhine state of Myanmar. It killed more than 200 people in Myanmar. Myanmar was not ready. They were not prepared. They were not adapted. They did not issue the warnings. And even after they got hit by the cyclone, the government of Myanmar in the capital did not allow relief to go into the Rakhine state because they're Muslims and they didn't like that. And they stopped the relief from going to help them. All right? So what I'm illustrating to you is what you can do to minimize loss and damage by investing in adaptation. And if you don't do that, then the loss and damage that you will suffer is going to be orders of magnitude much bigger than anything you would have been able to do. So the two go together. I don't see a difference between adaptation and loss and damage anymore. Adaptation is minimizing the loss and damage, but you cannot bring it to zero. And then when it happens, you have to deal with it. There's no question about doing the two together, in my view. Thank you.
Do you want to share another example?
Yes, of course. Maybe I would add to Saleemul's frame about adaptation and preparedness, the notion of risk and risk allocation. I think this is what is changing with how loss and damage have to be framed into national public policies is that they have to we have to have a national for each and every country. Every country has to have its own analysis of all the risk that he will have to face. Tribute to Lorraine, it's her work. This and therefore this discussion at the national level is going to be absolutely necessary, because after that, all the financial strategy can be then addressed and designed and so on. And of course, they need to be addressed and designed with incorporating as much as possible a dialogue with the community, who know a lot and can be part of the response and the preparation to the crisis. And part of the risk will be kept and handled at the local, at the regional, at the national level, and will not need external support, but part will need to be financed, and this is where a development finance institution can come. For instance, when we support some insurance mechanism, because indeed private sector will not continue the job or start the job, because in those countries they haven't done a lot for now, or some preparedness and early warning systems. We can do that, of course, support with that. And this is where also the loss and damage fund will come and fill as much as possible the gap, enhance the coordination of all the stakeholders, because it's going to be very much required. But it means that we need to have the vision at the national level. This is what we will start with Senegal through a research work at the beginning. Let's build evidence on what the sea level rise is going to have as impact on the Senegalese coast. Let's have the dialogue at the local level, at the regional, at the national level on how to handle this. And then let's build the strategy for Senegal on their answer to those flooding and coastal erosion risk. And we have to do this on all systems, not only on coasts, but on all systems which are, of course, to be impacted by climate change.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure you might have more questions, but there's still opportunities to discuss during the small reception. Big round of applause for the panelists, please.